is Avenue J.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming tonight. It's always difficult when we have a week off to start up again, so it's nice to see that we have a good representation again of the broad spectrum of Brooklyn Jewry here, and perhaps even parts further west of our location. Tonight's topic is a difficult one. We're going to look at a character who's really an excuse to look at a larger phenomenon. I mean, sometimes I'll give you a figure. We're going to speak tonight about Count Emicho of Leiningen. Not a particularly well-known character, but his association with the First Crusade of 1096 is especially important, and his role in the Crusade will give us an opportunity to discuss the nature of this important event in Jewish history and understand a little bit about what it meant to Ashkenazic Jewry in particular. And I hope by the end of the evening we'll have an opportunity to reflect on what the Crusades mean for Jews over a much larger span of time, and specifically to look at the question of how the Crusades shaped Ashkenazic identity in particular. Count Emicho in particular, there's not a lot of to say about him as an individual, but he will be rather a piedmont or a launching pad for a larger discussion of the Crusades. So without any further discussion, let's go straight to the material itself. The Crusades, of course, are an exceptionally important moment in world history. In many ways, even today, 1,000 years later, we are still reaping the whirlwind of the Crusades. It's well known, of course, that the Islamic State in their propaganda routinely refer to the West as the Crusaders, specifically hearkening back to this period. Ironically, they often refer to Jews as Crusaders, which is especially ridiculous because we were victimized quite heavily by the Crusaders. But nevertheless, the Islamic world tends to see the Crusaders as everything that is evil about the West. The proto-colonialist movement, the rapacious attitudes, and the extreme intolerance of the Crusaders wreaked havoc on Islamic societies in Jerusalem and parts beyond, including, by the way, wreaking havoc on Christian societies as they made their way towards the Holy Land. And it is kind of like a seam in Western history. The Crusades, beginning in 1096, were a series of phenomena that dictated the nature of the relationship between the European Christian world and the Middle Eastern Islamic world for the next millennium. So it's extremely important on a whole host of historical indices for understanding how we got to where we are today. Furthermore, the Crusades were one of the great integrative movements of the High Middle Ages, the beginning of the High Middle Ages, when European principalities could come together for the first time, really, for one great project, for one ideal that, at least on paper, sounded like a really, really good thing, and bring them together under the authority and leadership of a single institution, that is the Church. This sparked 300 years of ascendance for the Catholic Church, which spelled at its apex the nadir of Jewish civilization in Christian Europe, because we suffered greatly as the Church tended to increase its power, the Catholic Church in particular. So the Crusades really speak to the integration of Europe as a single polity that would ultimately, I think, have a tremendous impact on the later scientific revolution, ultimately the Protestant Reformation, which was, of course, the pendulum swinging back the other way. But the Crusades, I think, can be the beginning of a straight line towards Europe's ascendance in the West as a whole, and Europe's domination of the globe through its daughter civilization, which is America. So in many ways, the Crusades is an exceptionally important point in world history. We're going to focus in on one small aspect of this much larger historical phenomenon, and that is, of course, the experience of the Jews in the Rhineland in the terrible year 1096. I'm trying to understand what that means. So let's go to the historical background, and then we'll see exactly how the Jews fit in. Specifically, the Crusades were initiated by Pope Urban II in the year 1095. The immediate impetus for the Crusades, which perhaps I should define what exactly are the Crusades. The Crusades as a movement, and they spanned over several centuries because they were repeated crusades, were a gathering of European Christians to release Jerusalem in particular from the control of the Muslims. Islam, of course, had been in the region since the 7th century. Jerusalem and the entire Eastern Mediterranean was under Islamic control. And this was not a terrible thing for most religions because people were granted really quite ready access to the pilgrimage sites that they wanted. It may have rankled Christian sensibilities to some degree to say that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was under Muslim control and so on, but they had established a modus vivendi for the last 400 years. In the 11th century, there were some comparatively minor conflicts over the right of Christian pilgrims to gain access to the Muslim-dominated Christian shrines. And so there was an appeal to the Catholic Pope, Urban II, shown here, by the Patriarch of Constantinople for his assistance in releasing those shrines from Islamic control, or at least doing something to guarantee more ready access for Christian pilgrims to Jerusalem. Pope Urban II saw this not only as an opportunity to, promote spiritual tourism, to allow Christians to gain access to these sites, but more significantly, he saw the fact that his rival, the Patriarch of Constantinople, representing Eastern Orthodox Christianity, was reaching out to the Western Church, to the Catholic Pope for assistance, meant that this was a great moment for ecumenism, meaning for joining the Church that had splintered in the 11th century over a whole host of smaller doctrinal issues. And so Pope Urban II decided to respond to this request with alacrity and with energy. And he proclaimed a holy movement that in, really a jihad kind of way, to use a Muslim term for a Christian purpose, he called upon all Christians to rise up and to organize themselves and to make their way to Jerusalem and free the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and other holy sites from Muslim domination. They were to brand themselves with a cross, hence the word crusader, meaning that their clothing was decorated with a cross, and they were to wage this holy war, which involved many principalities throughout Central Europe, gathering together and making their way to the Holy Land. It was an exceptionally popular call to arms. An incredible response erupted from not only the unemployed knights and nobles of France, to whom Urban II was really directing his call, thinking that all of these otherwise unengaged individuals were, kind of like single males between the ages of 18 and 24. If they're not propertied and they're not married, they're just going to be up to no good, so you might as well get them to go on some kind of war. He was hoping to get that audience, and he did in fact get them, but it actually energized the population as a whole. There was something about, to use Chip and Dan Heath's term, there was something sticky about the idea of Christians uniting to make their way to this far-off land, that it really appealed to the popular imagination, and it cut a broad swath of social, cut across a broad swath of social classes and economic classes. People wanted to participate in this grand venture, and so all kinds of individuals tossed in with this challenge. It was not something that was well supported. It was not a well organized military venture, and as a result you had quite a bit of chaos with all of the various groups that strove to make their way to Jerusalem. But nevertheless, It captivated the imagination, and within a few short months they had actually made it to Jerusalem, conquered Jerusalem. Later, it's true, they would lose Jerusalem and so on, but it excited the European mind to such a degree that, in fact, it lives on in contemporary society today. We even use the term crusader quite loosely, and we say someone is a crusader for one cause or another, like someone is a crusader for not talking in shul, right? That would be a singularly inappropriate use of the term crusader. Someone is a crusader for tzedakah or something like that. But we use that term very loosely. It's speaking to these armies for Christianity. Here's a sense of, you can see some of the feeling of it. These crusaders on the left here mounted on horses and wearing crosses, and they're following, as it were, Jesus himself, holding a book. Looks like he's got a sword in his teeth. I'm not exactly sure what that symbol means, but the idea is it was an ideological war, it was a religious war, it was a holy war. It was meant to have a sort of level of cleanliness to it, a level of purity to it, which unfortunately was not at all the case among the crusaders themselves, who were motivated by much darker and baser drives. The Crusades were noted for their incredibly bloodthirsty attacks on Muslims, particularly in the region of Jerusalem. But more than that, you have to imagine that this is a movement that involved tens of thousands of people dislocated from their homes, wandering across the entire European continent, and with no logistical support whatsoever. It's true that you have a few noblemen, particularly from France, who are well outfitted, and they've got their armor, they've got their squires, they've got their gold doubloons or whatever, and they are able to pay for themselves and their retinue. But you have otherwise a whole host of people who are just groupies hanging on and making their way towards Jerusalem and simply picking up supplies as they go along. So these groups were especially hated even by Christians, and they came into tremendous conflict with Christian communities as they made their way across Europe. Most of them did not make it past Hungary. As soon as they got to Hungary, the Hungarian Christians rose up against the Crusaders and slaughtered their own co-religionists because they could not handle the rapacious attitudes of the Crusaders coming through their territories. They also absolutely refused to cover any of their furniture with plastic, and so they were personae non gratae in Hungarian lands. Here, however, is a map of several of the Crusades, 4 of them in particular. The first Crusade is marked here in red, and you can see that several groups made their way all the way across Europe into Turkey, crossing at Constantinople, where the Patriarch had issued his call, and eventually down to the Holy Land, where they ultimately were able to conquer Israel. So that's, and of course the Crusades were repeated several times. Maritime Crusades, as you can see here. It was really quite a massive, continental movement that had phenomenal impact on the shaping of the European mind. Well, basically, it accomplished a lot of things in the sense of, integrating various European peoples, giving them a consciousness of being one Christian people under one king, that is the Pope in this case, elevating the power of the Church, which was, not necessarily so powerful, and centralizing it. And later, or 300 years later, eventually the Church would begin its process of decline. But this was the moment of great ascendancy of the Church. If you can imagine, let's say a politician in New York getting up and saying, we should all, follow Mr. Goodleman, and we should become green. We should, everybody should recycle immediately. And everybody in America should realize this, oh my gosh, all those paper products and plastic that I've been wasting, and starting this kind of movement that would coalesce around Mr. Goodleman's research. Mr. Goodleman, by the way, for those of you who are watching on the internet, runs a tremendous not-for-profit organization called Re-Jews, right, which is all about Jews involved in recycling. This is the beginning of the movement right here on the internet. Okay, 28,000 people see this every month, and they are going to start recycling because of Mr. Goodwin. So that's in a short word what the Crusades accomplished. It's an integrative movement because it brings together the continent under one kind of at least quasi-political rule. But on the other hand, it involves violence, and whenever you have violence, that also disrupts existing traffic patterns. Kind of like a Pax Romana has a tremendously beneficial beneficial impact in the long term, but maybe not in the short term. It was actually, thinking about your question a little more deeply, it was in a way the increased level of hostility between Muslims and Christians that would exist for the next 500 years, 1,000 years really, benefited the Jews, because Jews had population centers in both Muslim and Christian lands and were more easily tolerated in their international commerce. So that's another, you should hang out with Dr. Levine, because that was also a tough question. I'm a little scared of those. Let me go back to the material. Whew. Boy. All right, so Count Emicho specifically. Let's look at the Jewish aspect of the Crusades, which revolves around the very first Crusade, which was 1096. The terrible summer of that year, which is memorialized in synagogues around the world every Saturday afternoon with the tremendously moving Av HaRachamim prayer that is recited after the reading of the Torah, which was specifically composed in the 12th century to memorialize the victims of the Crusades. If you look at that text more carefully this Saturday when you go to shul, you won't see any specific reference to the Crusades, because the author of that piyut wisely understood that there would be many more martyrologies in the Jewish future, and so it's very evocative, beautiful language. It was written specifically for the victims of the Crusades, but it contains a much larger scope. At any rate, although we have basically three groups of crusaders that were active during this period. The first group were those knights that were specifically targeted by Urban II. Those are people who had established military backgrounds, they had a certain source of wealth, they had patrons, they had the wherewithal to actually mount this cause. In fact, there's some historical debate. Did Urban II really know what he was getting started here when he made this call? Did he realize how deeply it would reach into society? It could be he was just thinking specifically of this military class, who are regular military, who you can see are well outfitted and so on, who can make this kind of journey. However, he also unleashed this kind of elemental drive that was in keeping with the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times, which is most well illustrated by this figure, Peter the Hermit, who was kind of a popular preacher who went around just simply rabble-rousing and inspiring the masses to also participate in this crusade. And these are people who had no preparation whatsoever for this tremendously difficult journey, and they simply left with whatever provisions they could carry under incredibly bizarre circumstances. For example, we have excellent sources on the crusade written by both Jewish chroniclers and by Christian chroniclers. This was a major movement that inspired a lot that inspired a lot of attention, and we have a lot of historians working on it who had contemporary eyewitness accounts. And one particular account always fascinates me. Peter the Great had a whole bunch of people around him who were apparently motivated by a very holy goose. There was a goose that was attached to his master, and she would walk around talking about how this goose was determined to go on the crusade, because the goose kept on sort of heading towards the east, and whenever the mistress of the goose would hang back, the goose would come back and kind of like try and draw her to the east with her. And so they considered this the holy goose, quite literally, and they saw this as evidence that the Crusades were divinely inspired. Another figure related to Peter the Hermit's crowd, inspired the crowd by taking off his tunic and revealing a massive cross that had been tattooed on his back. And he said that he woke up one morning and this cross was on his back, and it was a signal that everyone should follow the cross to Jerusalem, follow him to Jerusalem. So obviously we're tapping into some kind of bizarre, magical thinking of the time, but it really appealed to the common masses, and you had all kinds of the lumpen proletariat kind of rising up and joining along with it. Peter the Hermit was perhaps the most significant of these groups. But this was not the worst of them. The worst that we have to deal with were the ones who were very excited by the idea of taking over Jerusalem from the infidel, from the unbeliever, from the Muslim in this context, but didn't really see the point of schlepping all the way to Jerusalem to do it. In other words, many, such as Emicho of Leningen, said, why should we, bestir ourselves to travel all the way to Jerusalem and attack the infidel there when we have infidels living right here in our backyard, in the Rhineland, in towns like Köln or Speyer, Worms, and Mainz? Why should we go all the way to Jerusalem when we have Jews living right here? Are they not also the enemies of Christ? And even more so, they were the killers of Christ. They were guilty of deicide. And so therefore, Emicho and others, who are kind of like the third class underneath the Peter the Hermit's followers, who were also interested in acting out for the cause that Urban II had inspired, but they were not ready to make the entire journey to Jerusalem. These are the people who we're most concerned with, and they are the ones that are most associated with the Jewish experience of the Crusades, because it is this last class of crusaders, would-be crusaders, who had nothing to do whatsoever with Jerusalem, who wreaked the most havoc on Jewish communities in northern Germany in particular. This depiction here shows Jews on the right being attacked by crusaders. You can tell they're Jews. The picture was drawn quite a bit later because they're wearing this pointed hat here known as the Judenhut, or the Jewish hat, which was mandated by the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215. It's a very useful thing for art historians because when you look at medieval reproductions, you can always see which ones are the Jews. And of course, the holy figures in the background with the halo and the crusaders are wreaking havoc on the Jewish communities and killing them at will. So really that's what happens in 1096. The call to arms comes out in December of 1095. Takes a few months in the springtime for armies to get themselves organized, and then by the summer, as the troops are beginning to make their way down to Jerusalem, several of these bands, led by people like Count Emicho, decide to simply pillage the Jewish communities in the northern Rhineland, and that's what is the essential history of the Crusades vis-a-vis the Jews. Okay, let's go on to have a look at it. Here's a map that gives you a sense of it. Jewish settlement in northern Germany was still quite sparse at that time. We're talking about communities that may have had perhaps 100, 200 families would be considered a very large community in Ashkenaz at that point. Jews had made their way across the coast of North Africa and up into Spain in the 8th century in particular. And then slowly, for reasons that we discussed a couple of weeks ago, there seems to have been some kind of climate change around the turn of the millennium. Historians are not exactly sure why this is the case, but sometime around the year 1000, suddenly a lot of northern Europe became much more arable than it ever was before. And so you have an increased settlement all around, Jews and non-Jews obviously, in northern Europe, which leads a lot of Jews to be drawn to these regions for economic possibilities. After the Crusades, 1096, there is a slow but steady movement of Jews towards the east. Scholars debate exactly how significant were the Crusades in beginning this march to the east, but the region that is known to Jews as Ashkenaz, which is basically northern Germany up here, most of the Jews from this region make their way out east, so most Ashkenazic Jews today hail more immediately from Eastern Europe, even though their origins, say 500 years prior, were in Germany per se. That's what this map kind of represents here. Okay, so let's talk about the nature of the violence a little bit. And now I'm going to get to some of the dark parts. So the Crusades were incredibly awful to Jews. The level of brutality was unprecedented in many ways. We're talking about wanton, cruel, rapacious, awful brutality. The descriptions boggle the mind, and we have corroboration of those descriptions. They're not just extreme martyrologies written by Jewish chroniclers. We also have Christian accounts of the attacks on the Jews of Speyer, Worms, and Mainz. And by the way, the Christian chroniclers describe them with tremendous distaste. Count Emicho was reviled by Christian chroniclers who felt that his brand of crusading violence, brought disrepute to the entire movement. So we have validations of the specific murders that are described in the Chronicles. Absolutely horrific murders. How did Jews respond to these attacks? So I'm going to talk about 5 distinct approaches how Jews responded. The first, and they might be somewhat surprising, the first response was that Jews ran to the church for assistance. I'm not talking about conversion here. Jews ran to the church hoping that the church would protect them. And in fact, the church did as much as it could to protect them. And this is one of these great ironies. The Crusades, of course, is after all a Christian invention. We're talking about, a movement to elevate the authority of the Pope, to take away Jerusalem from the Muslims and so on. But nevertheless, the ecclesiastical authorities are the allies of the Jews. Why is this so? And by the way, this will, I know, undermine tens of thousands of Beis Yaakov productions in which Christians are all uniformly anti-Semitic to their core and there's no hope for them whatsoever. It simply was not the case. There are several reasons why this is. First of all, to be sure, there were anti-Semitic elements in the church because this, we talked about this a few weeks ago, this is a complicated relationship between a mother religion and a daughter religion, and to deny the rejection of Judaism as part of church theology would be absurd. However, from the 4th century on, the church had laid down a very clear element of canon law called the doctrine of witness. It was perhaps best articulated by St. Augustine, who wrote that the Jews must be tolerated for a theological purpose, because at the end of days, when the Christian Messiah returns, then the Jews will be here to validate that this is in fact the right Messiah. Since the Jews are the people of the Messiah, we need to be around in order to prove that he's back. This is a very important theological point, and as a result, the church mandated in canon law that Jews must be allowed to live within Christian communities with impunity. Now, there were restrictions on Jewish activity, restrictions on how they could build their synagogues, how they could carry themselves in public. It would not make sense if Jews were allowed to become wealthy and become objects of jealousy for Christians, so Jews had to be kept in a subordinate state. But as second-class citizens, they were to be protected. So the church actually had very clear statements that protected Jews, at least in theory and in law. Where you see this especially clearly is with the blood libels that begin to circulate in the 13th century and onward, which seem to be sort of elemental things that come up from the lower clergy, who are often illiterate themselves. And the lower clergy are saying around Passover times that Jews drink Christian blood and all kinds of crazy things like this. And the upper church, the popes and the bishops and so on, are releasing papal bull after papal bull and proclamations saying, no, it's not true. Jews don't drink Christian blood. Please don't kill the Jews. Things like that. But this is a social conflict that occurs within the vertical organization of the church as a whole, something that, I'll leave that point alone. So and one last point about why the Jews would go to the church for protection, let us recall that Jews were overwhelmingly urban in settlement, as opposed to Christians who were overwhelmingly agricultural, who were rural in their forms of settlement. Jews, as we well know, have to live within walking distance of synagogue, a mikveh, Chinese restaurants. There's no way that they can live spread out in the hinterland. We stay together for protection purposes, we stay together for commercial purposes, and we occupied an economic niche where villagers would come in to do their marketing with the Jews, but the Jewish commercial centers were always in medium-sized towns. And who else lives in medium-sized towns? You've got your burghers, you've got your guild, and then you've got the church. Cathedrals were always located in the urban centers. And so we were directly proximate with ecclesiastical authorities at the higher level. So it makes sense that Jews would go to the church for assistance. And ironically, perhaps not ironically, the church protected the Jews as best they could. In the first initial attacks by Count Emicho, for example, in the city of Speyer, the Jews went for protection within the bishop's compound, and the bishop sent out his guards, and they actually cut the hands off crusaders who wanted to molest the Jews. Cut their hands off quite literally. We have corroboration from both Christian and Jewish sources, and not surprisingly, that put an end to it right away. Speyer only suffered very minimal damage. Less than a dozen Jews were killed in the initial melee, and the church authorities were able to put down the rioting almost immediately. Later, however, and this gives you a sense of the kind of internal conflict within the Christian community, at the next town, I believe it was Worms, the Count Emicho's forces would not be allayed by a small show of force from the ecclesiastical authorities and their limited guards, and they threatened to overwhelm the bishop's home, and in fact they invaded it and dragged the Jews out themselves. So the church only had a certain degree of authority, real power that could be wielded when it was faced with mob violence. So the first somewhat surprising response of the Jews under this kind of attack is to appeal to the ecclesiastical authorities. In later crusades, Jews were able to anticipate the possibility of violence and go to the popes well in advance and actually receive, for a fee, that'll be one of the other responses, clear directives that would filter down to protect them from mob violence of this nature. Perhaps I'll make one last point. In general, when you look at the history of Jewish diaspora settlement, we tend to thrive in moderately discriminatory environments. Where we do not thrive at all is in anarchic environments. If there is a ruler, even if he has moderately anti-Semitic policies, we can live with that. But if there is no Rechtsstaat, if there is no society based on law, then we have a terrible problem, as we see illustrated in the Crusades. Ms. Harris, you had a question.
I don't quite understand the whole witness thing. It almost sounds like a veiled way to protect the Jews by those who were sympathetic toward us.
That's a good way to put it. The doctrine of witness, you see, the witness in the sense of being able to testify, right? We were there, so to speak, as a community, Jews were there when the Messiah, the Christian Messiah, was first walking the planet. And so therefore, we're the only ones who can really confirm it when he comes back. That's the way this argument goes. And that's why, by the way, Jews tend to have a very high point value for conversion, right? Because if you convert, I don't know, a Hindu to Christianity, okay, big deal. But if you convert a Jew to Christianity, taka, that's something. I think they actually says that in Latin, taka, that's something. Okay.
And he's no longer Jewish to bear testimony.
Yeah, but his testimony is so much more clear. You know, I give this, I don't want to take too much time away, but I do give this argument about cholent recipes. No, okay, I do actually. It's very. Let's say, for example, you have this woman who makes cholent a certain way, and she has a daughter who goes off to college. Daughter goes to college, she comes back for Thanksgiving, and she says, "Oh, Ma, you got to try this new cholent recipe that I learned in college. It has peanut butter in it. It's fantastic." They have cholent at Shabbos. The daughter says, "How is it?" The mother says, "Well, it's okay, you know, but I prefer the old cholent." The daughter says, "No way. This peanut, how can you say that? The peanut butter cholent is so much better." So the mother says, "You can say what you want, but the old one's better." And they say, "You know what? Let's give it to Bubby. Let's see what Bubby says." So they make the cholent, they bring it to Bubby. Bubby says, "It's nice, but you know, I really prefer the old cholent." They say, no, that's not right. So let's go to the altar Bubby. They go to the nursing home, they find the altar Bubby. She also likes the old cholent. So the young daughter gets like enraged. How is it that nobody is recognizing my cholent as superior? And the only way she can really prove that her cholent is better is by going back in time to the original cholent makers and getting them to agree. If the altar Bubby would agree that the new cholent is better, then she would be vindicated. And that's exactly the doctrine of witness. We, the Christians, we're like the altar Bubby. And until we agree that the new cholent is better, they'll never be totally satisfied. That's the argument. That's kind of weird. Let's go on. Okay, that's number one. Number two, second one, so-called contributions. And this is what one of my students quite famously said, that the Jewish response to persecution is flee or flee. That's the strategy, right? Flight was not really a possibility because the violence was so sudden. It was within the space of a few days. They're so close to each other, these smaller communities. But Jews did try to anticipate the violence by making a quote-unquote contribution. I mean, don't forget, these are crusaders who are promising to make their way across Europe. They have no provisions. They are simply going to be raping the land as they go along. So it stands to reason that if the Jews would provide them with some gold, then they would be mollified and they would go their merry way. This did not work with Emicho. Emicho took their money, waited a couple days, and went in and killed them anyways. So this is one of the strategies that it was a rare case of the total failure of that strategy. It would be, ironically, a strategy that Jews would attempt in the 20th century with the horrors of the Holocaust, also completely misunderstanding the nature of Hitlerian anti-Semitism, which would not be mollified by material gain. But there were examples of the Jews trying to buy off the Crusaders with very little luck. Third, self-defense. Now, unfortunately, the video for some reason is blocked. This is so cool. This is actually a Yemenite Jewish martial artist whose name is Yehoshua Sofer. And I have a video here which is blocked for some reason, I guess by the Brooklyn filters. But he's actually got this amazing martial, you'll have to see it on the internet version, I'll try and pop it in there. He's got this amazing martial art which he claims goes back to ancient Yemen, and it's based on the Hebrew alphabet. And he does all these amazing katas where he turns his hands in the shape of the Hebrew letters and uses them in self-defense. It is really quite amazing. There were occasions in which Jews armed themselves and went out to fight the enemy. This is, I think, worthy of much greater analysis, because one of the experiences that Jews have had throughout their long history of persecution is that pogromists are typically cowards, and that a show of force, we see it in 1919, 1905, 1884, many of the great pogrom periods, 1648 to a lesser degree, that a small show of force can drive away a band of attackers. And we have a rabbi named Meshulam in Mainz who actually girds himself up with armor, and he brings out a few group of Jews to fight against the Count Emicho. But Count Emicho was a much more organized and much larger force, and they simply overwhelmed Rabbi Meshulam and his forces, and they went on to massacre the Jews. So this is a fascinating but fairly small phenomenon in the scope of the Jewish responses to the Crusades. So there's the cool video, and we just have to see it later. And of course, conversion. Now, the Christian crusaders were ideologically motivated as well. There's no question that they would accept conversion as a proxy for murder among their victims. A quick baptism would do the trick. And that seemed to be, the ideological basis of their attacks upon the Jews. And so many Jews, acting out of fear for their lives, did submit to baptism. And after this frenzy of violence was gone, it only lasted a couple of months in the summer of 1096, there's a tremendous amount of responsa literature, including responsa written by none other than the great Rashi, justifying this apparent breach of Jewish protocol by, under duress, pretending to accept Christianity. The dominant mode of the poskim, the authorities, was to accept these Jews back into the fold and to recognize that their conversion was, so-called conversion, was done only for fear of their lives and does not represent a transgression of the terrible crime of apostasy. But there was a minority opinion who said that no, that's it. They're out of the community and they're gone forever, even under these circumstances. The debate on exactly what this kind of conversion means, or this baptism means, goes all the way back to the Talmud. And in fact, the more rigid approach is one of the arguments for a distinct trend in Ashkenazic Jewry that I hope to return to in about 5 minutes. This picture here is kind of interesting. It's within the context of a medieval story, not specifically on conversion, but you can see the story here, obviously a Christian figure here, and these two figures are Jewish women, evidently a mother and a daughter, and they have decided to accept Christianity. They're holding up their hands, which in medieval, their fingers, which in medieval art is considered a very aggressive gesture meant to be used in sense of arguments, like I'm trying to prove you wrong. And here their Jewish husband and father, wearing the Judenhut, so you can recognize them as such, is arguing with them that they should not in fact have made this choice. How do you know that these three are Jewish, by the way? Yeah, very heavy caricatured physiognomy, which is characteristic of medieval iconography of Jews. They're often shown in rather grotesque poses, heavy noses, and so on. Okay, now the last and perhaps the most powerful and indicative and response of the Crusades, the one for which the Crusades are perhaps known more than any others, is martyrdom. That many Jews in the Crusades, particularly in the three towns of Speyer, Worms, and Mainz, or by the abbreviation Shum, actively decided that rather than submit to conversion, they would slaughter themselves and their children. And it was absolutely horrific. And the poetry that has been composed by Paitanim after the Crusades is incredibly powerful and moving, in which they describe the horrific choices that parents made to slaughter their own children rather than submit to the waters of baptism. You can't read a lot of these because they're absolutely overwhelming, but I will read you one section from one of the Chronicles that give you a sense of it. And note in this section the use of specific names, socioeconomic markers. These are not kind of placeholders for people. These are real people that are being described by the medieval chronicler in a specific way. Okay. There was a notable lady, Rachel, the daughter of Rabbi Isaac ben Reb Asher. This is, by the way, from Robert Chazen's very important book, European Jewry and the First Crusades. He translates the two most important Hebrew chronicles at the back of the book. And as I mentioned earlier, these are corroborated by Christian accounts as well. So she said to her companions, I have 4 children. On them as well have no mercy, lest these uncircumcised come and seize them, and they remain in their pseudo-faith. With them as well you must sanctify the holy name. One of her companions came and took the knife. When she saw the knife, she cried loudly and bitterly. She beat her face, crying and saying, Where is your steadfast love, O Lord? She took Isaac, her small son, indeed he was very lovely, and slaughtered him. You get the sense that the chronicler actually knew what Isaac looked like. She said to her companions, Wait, do not slaughter Isaac before Aaron. But the lad Aaron, when he saw that his brother had been slaughtered, cried out, Mother, mother, do not slaughter me. He then went and hid himself under a bureau. She took her 2 daughters, Bella and Matrona, and sacrificed them to the Lord God of hosts, who commanded us not to abandon pure awe of him and to remain loyal to him. When the saintly one finished sacrificing her 3 children before our Creator, she then lifted her voice and called out to her son, Aaron, Aaron, where are you? I shall not have pity or mercy on you either. She pulled them by the leg from under the bureau where he had hidden, and sacrificed him before the sublime and exalted God. She then put them under her 2 sleeves, 2 on one side and 2 on the other near her heart. They convulsed near her until the Crusaders seized the chamber. They found her sitting and mourning them. They said to her, Show us the money which you have under your sleeves. When they saw the slaughtered children, they smote her and killed her. With regard to them and to her it is said, Mother and babes were dashed to death together. She died with them, as did the earlier saintly one with her 7 sons, a reference to Hannah. from the Talmudic literature. With regard to her, it is said, the mother of the child is happy. The Crusaders killed all those in the chamber and stripped them naked. They were still writhing and convulsing in their blood as they stripped them. See, O Lord, and behold how abject I have become. And there are many, many such descriptions in the Chronicles of horrific violence of this nature, which exalts the choice of martyrdom, which exalts the concept of Kiddush Hashem, of dying for the sake of God's name, and even slaughtering one's own children for it. This is fairly unprecedented in Jewish history. Masada is a prime example of this, but it's hard to compare them because Masada, first of all, was an outlier event which was not approved of by the rabbis, and hence it did not make tremendous way in Talmudic literature. This was a movement that achieved great primacy in the liturgy, particularly on fast days like Tisha B'Av, and in many ways helped form the Ashkenazic mindset. We'll return to that. So let's think about what does this mean for Ashkenazic Jewry. There is some debate over the actual demographic impact of the Crusades. We are not talking about a massive movement such as the 1648-49 pogroms in Ukraine. We're not talking about anything even like 1919, which was even larger, because all of the demographic data we have, the economic data that we have, seems to indicate that a European Jewry recovered rather quickly after the Crusades. The chronicles themselves are difficult to work with in terms of numbers, because numbers were often used in a very poetic sense, and you know, when it says 400, it may mean a lot, but it doesn't necessarily mean 400 people, which would be a devastating amount. So it's not clear exactly how important this was on a demographic level. It did not seem to alter significantly the patterns of Jewish settlement. At the same time, however, the literary impact, the impact of this event on the Weltanschauung of Jews at this time was absolutely crucial. And we have to contrast it with the development of Sephardic Jewry that tended in an altogether different direction. Now this is kind of painting with broad strokes, but some have argued that after the Crusades, Ashkenazic Jewry developed a much more insular and inward-looking mentality that viewed the non-Jewish Christian world as being fundamentally toxic, dangerous for Jews, and so Jews tended to bend their intellectual arcs inward with much more focus on Talmudic study, much more hesitancy to approach non-Jewish culture in all of its forms. Sephardic Jewry, particularly in North Africa and in Spain, on the other hand, was still deeply engaged in non-Jewish culture, very much participating in Arabic poetry, Arabic philosophy, Arabic politics, Spanish politics, and so on. And Jews in the Sephardic realm were really quite heavily integrated into society while maintaining a distinct Jewish identity. So some historians have argued that the Crusades sort of created a sort of path for Ashkenazic Jewry that marked themselves out as self-identifying as different, whereas Sephardic Jews were able to maintain some kind of balance with the outside world. Of course, we'll see with the persecutions of the 14th and 15th century that when it came to the choice of conversion or martyrdom, the prominent choice for Sephardic Jewry was to find a modus vivendi with conversion, creating the so-called Marano phenomenon of crypto-Judaism. That was not even considered a possibility for the victims of the Crusades, who chose to slaughter themselves and their families rather than submit to even a sham conversion. So I think this is a huge overgeneralization of Ashkenazic and Sephardic patterns of development, but nevertheless there is a nugget of truth to this that bears further meditation. So the legacy of Count Emicho is really quite profound. On the one hand, his personal story, after attacking 4 communities in northern Germany, he went on following the roving bands of Peter the Hermit towards Hungary, and there his troops were massacred. He himself fled the battlefront and made his way back home to Leiningen, where he lived out his days as a fairly wealthy count, with supporting himself also by the wages that he had earned during the Crusades. So he disappears from Jewish history as an individual. However, the legacy of the Crusades was exceptionally important in creating a sort of thought process for Ashkenazic Jews and a vision of themselves as they considered their relationship to the non-Jewish environment. I think I've basically run out of things that I want to say, so at this point I will bring this to a conclusion. I want to thank you very deeply for your attention and your tolerance. Next week we will, God willing, go back to a happier topic. We're going to look at the life and works of Avraham ben Harambam, the son of Maimonides, who was actually far more prolific even than his father, and there'll be a lot to say about his life, and of course living in the shadow of someone as great as the Rambam is quite a subject unto itself. Thank you again for coming, and I hope you have an excellent evening.
Stand clear of the closing doors, please.